Good morning. My name is Christina Ruedas, and I am an associate attorney at Richards Brandt Miller Nelson. I'll be talking to you today about Verify Complaince. The Verify program in Utah is even newer than the recent updates we've had to the I-9 program. And so there are many pitfalls and dangers facing employers who are trying to comply with this law. In 2011, the Utah legislature enacted a law requiring employers who have 15 or more employees to use the E-Verify program. We'll talk about some common pitfalls, beginning with the risk of running afoul of federal anti-discrimination laws. Now, when you have a new employee and you complete the Form I-9, submit the initial inquiry, you will get results from an initial verification of the employment authorization of that employee. There are 3 possible results in that initial verification. We'll go through each one and talk about the appropriate reactions that you won't find laid out in the E-Verify law, but that are important to keep in mind to make sure that you're complying with other federal laws. The first is a result that every employer hopes for, and that is that the employee that they just hired is authorized to work in the United States. When that's the case, the inquiry ends there. If you get an employment authorization result, whether or not even if you suspect, maybe these documents aren't legitimate, maybe there's something going on that I don't know about, if E-Verify says that they are authorized to work at your place of business, then you must allow them to. You can't have any follow-up conversations. You don't want to be caught asking follow-up questions about their plans to stay in the United States, their national origin, their families. You simply must let them work. The second and possibly trickiest scenario is that you receive a notification that there is a tentative non-confirmation, or a TNC, from the Social Security Administration. Now, as an employer, that might cause alarm, and the gut reaction would be to play it safe, ask the employee not to come back to work until that is resolved, and that gut reaction would be wrong, because under the law, you're required to allow an employee to continue working even if there's a tentative non-confirmation. Now, this must seem a little against common sense, because here we're talking about being so careful at complying with all the laws, making sure you're only employing those that are authorized to work in the United States. But the division of the Justice Department Civil Rights Division, OSC, will come after employers who either A, ask the employee to stop working while the TNC is being resolved, or B, have a conversation with that employee and say anything that could be construed as discouraging that employee to come to work, discouraging that employee to contest the tentative non-confirmation, because as you may be surprised to hear, the federal government is not perfect, and neither are its programs. So sometimes these tentative non-confirmations are issued in error, and the employee is perfectly authorized to work in the United States. So we'd recommend having a very careful conversation with the employee, notifying them that a tentative non-confirmation has been received, reiterating that they may continue to work, that they are welcome to continue working, notifying them that they have the option to contest that tentative non-confirmation, and that is completely their decision. So you're not saying anything that's discouraging them from doing that. And most importantly, don't try to investigate on your own whether or not they're authorized to work in the United States. Comply with E-Verify, allow them to contest the tentative non-confirmation, but don't say anything that could be construed as discouraging them to do so. Now, once a tentative non-confirmation has been contested, you may receive a final non-confirmation letting you know that the Social Security Administration has confirmed that this person is not authorized to work in the United States, and then you can ask them very politely to not work at your place of business, that you cannot employ them under federal law. And the third issue that could come up, the third result from this initial verification, is a DHS verification in process, meaning that DHS is doing their own investigation. Something besides a social security number has alerted DHS to a possible issue, and the result is similar to that with a tentative non-confirmation. Until there's been a final notice that that employee is not authorized to work in the United States, you must allow that employee to continue working. Now here's a chart to give you an idea of how rare a tentative non-confirmation is issued, but once it is issued, there is a possibility that that they were in fact authorized to work. Some other considerations for avoiding running afoul of anti-discrimination laws is to have a very specific list of employees who are authorized to use E-Verify. If you have a big business with many supervisors and managers, you don't want to give each supervisor and manager the ability to go in and check E-Verify every time they suspect that someone working for them is not authorized to work in the United States. We recommend those in the HR or accounting departments, those who deal with the I-9 intake, to be the only ones authorized to run E-Verify. Again, like we discussed, contesting the tentative non-confirmations, have maybe specific employees who are authorized to have those conversations with the employees. That way you're not running into a situation where you have different people talking to employees, different people that are not trained to handle these situations, perhaps saying something that could be construed as asking an employee not to work anymore while the TNC is being resolved. Related to the I-9 audit compliance information that Barbara provided, you cannot request certain documentation for the I-9. The I-9 form allows options to submit documentation verifying that an employee is authorized to work in the United States. You cannot ask for certain types of documents specifically. If the employee presents a document that is authorized by the I-9, then you must accept it. Do not pre-screen applicants for employment authorization. So don't ask someone if they can. Don't ask an employee if you can run their name through E-Verify before they're even hired. And also do not selectively use E-Verify. We had a client who came to us a few years ago and said, Christina and Barbara, we're so good. We're trying to comply with E-Verify and federal laws that we are checking every one of our employees with a Hispanic last name to make sure that they are authorized to work because we don't want to run afoul of federal laws. And that, while somewhat misguided intentions, that is running afoul of anti-discrimination law. So it's a very fine line to walk. Now, there's a common misconception that there are no penalties or very minor penalties for complying with E-Verify. The Utah legislature a year ago finally updated the law to include very minor penalties, $100, no more than $100 for each employed unauthorized alien if E-Verify was not used to verify their employment. Now, that may lull some employers into a false sense of comfort. They may think, well, even if I don't exactly comply with E-Verify, a little slap on the wrist and I'll be fine. But that's not the case. When you combine the non-compliance with E-Verify with a non-compliance with I-9s, that's when you get hit with an aggravating factor. If ICE audits and finds any mistake in the I-9, which would trigger significant penalties, as Barbara reviewed in her portion of the presentation, if they also ICE can also look at the E-Verify program at your place of business, and if there's anything out of line with that can be considered an aggravating factor, aggravating the penalties under the I-9 audit by 2 or 3 times. And that results in significant penalties. And so that's not obvious from the face of the law, but there really are significant penalties for failing to comply with exactness with the E-Verify program. Now, related to that, there are significant fines and penalties for businesses that engage in a pattern or practice of hiring unauthorized aliens. Now, while you may, as a business owner, have good intentions and may seek to comply with E-Verify as well as you can, but you're busy or dealing with other things, that failure to comply can be considered part of a pattern or practice of knowingly hiring unauthorized aliens. For that reason, we recommend standardizing employment practices and having a written E-Verify policy, a written I-9 policy, and written human resources policies that are consistent so that you are conveying a sense of a good pattern and practice of only hiring those that are authorized to work in the United States. So what's the takeaway from E-Verify? The takeaway I would recommend keeping in mind is consistency. If you are consistent in the strength of your E-Verify policy, the strength, the exactness in which you're following E-Verify, as much as you are consistent with your I-9 policies, your anti-discrimination policies, then you can avoid penalties for a pattern of hiring unauthorized aliens. You avoid the aggravating factors that are possible with non-compliance with E-Verify, and you can ensure that your employees know how to use these programs so that you are complying with federal law.